if I become a Christian, I'm going to become poor. So it's going to go from bad to worse. And it was such a great journey that she went on to discover that's not the case. John 10:10, I've come that you may have life and life in all its fullness. It's the abundant life of God. And I remember speaking with her, and we had a time of prayer together in a kind of group setting. Everybody was pairing up, and so I got the privilege of praying with her. And I had a very clear word for her about two distinct things. And she had only been a believer, I want to say, 2 or 3 weeks. This was post-Alpha course. She'd come on the Alpha course, given her life to Christ. And so we were praying. And oh no, it was at the Holy Spirit Day. It was at the Holy Spirit Day of the Alpha course. That's what it was, that we were pairing up, right? And so I was praying with this lady, and I said, I feel like God's saying, is it okay if I speak into your life? And she went, yeah, okay. And I said, I feel like the Holy Spirit's telling me you need to reconcile with your ex-husband, and you need to start tithing. And she looked, she went, I haven't spoken to my ex-husband in over 25 years. And she said, and I can't afford to tithe. She said, I made £50 last week. I said, no, you made 45. 5 was God's. And she went, oh, yes, I can afford to tithe. Okay. And so that was on the Saturday. I caught up with her on the Sunday, the week after. She said, you will never believe what happened. And I went, go on.
I bet you I can.
Yeah. And on the next day, she had tithed. She said, she then got a call from her accountant that her tax bill that was due, which had always, she said she was always underwater in her tax bill. She said the whole tax bill was covered and she was £4,500 in credit. She said in the week she had contacted her son to try and get in touch with her ex-husband because there had been some domestic situations that meant that she didn't speak with him anymore. And the son said, oh, he's in hospital. He'll be out in a week or so. Get in touch then. She said the Holy Spirit just wouldn't lay up. She said, so I called him back and said, no, I need to see him. And she went and saw him in hospital and he was dying and they reconciled. They forgave each other. She then went in the ambulance with him to the hospice. They were reminiscing about their times with the children and all of these things. And they forgave each other and he died in her arms. And it was all because the Holy Spirit had nudged her and wouldn't let up. And part of it was financial, but part of it wasn't. And this is the thing, I think, again, it's a really unpopular thing to say, but it's scriptural. Our finances being a proxy for our heart directly impact our ability to hear what God says and our ability to respond to the Holy Spirit. And I could take you through a whole study of that from Deuteronomy through to Proverbs, through to Psalms, through to the New Testament, where it's so clear.
Yeah.
And all of the glory is God's. This is the thing. It's the Holy Spirit. We're a hose pipe, right? The purpose of a hose pipe is not to get wet. But guess what? The inside of a pipe is always wet when it's transporting the water where it needs to be.
Yeah.
And so this is the thing. The capacity of a Christian life as you grow in your financial understanding is you get upgraded from a garden hose to a bigger gut, and suddenly you're a fire hose, and you can take volume and you can take pressure.
Yeah.
But the thing is, going back to that tithing thing where people tithe faithfully, but their heart's not in the right place. They're wanting fire hose pressure on a garden hose capacity, and that's tough.
Yeah. And God's not gonna.
He's not going to ruin them. He's not going to ruin them for the sake of their expectations.
Do you fancy a difficult question?
Please.
Okay. So, what would you say to someone who is not tithing because they aren't happy with how the church spends the money?
Great question. So we need to take a step back from that first before we can go forward. First and foremost, tithing as a principle, as a pattern, people have to understand it is not law or legalism. Tithing, the first time we see tithing is in Genesis, and Abraham, it was a knee-jerk reaction as the king of Salem, Melchizedek, came, and it says, and he gave. It was just an instant reaction. Okay, that was about 480 years prior to the law of Moses. God included it in the law of Moses. So it's there in Mosaic law. Jesus then reaffirms it in Matthew 23:23, and there's a parallel passage as well that affirms that. He's saying to the scribes and the Pharisees, you tithe on dill and mint and cumin, but you have neglected the weightier things of the law around mercy. He says, these you should do without neglecting the former. So Jesus affirms tithing. And then in Hebrews 7, it then links back to Melchizedek, right?
Mm-hmm.
Paul is writing, and he goes, and it's Jesus who receives our tithes, right? It's our high priest that receives our tithes. All of this A is a proxy for your heart. B, we have to remember we are giving it to God first and foremost. Very unfortunately, there are more cases of financial mismanagement than I would like there to be, than anybody would like there to be. However, God has still received that tithe. And when somebody is faithful with what they have and they return to God what is his, he can still bless them, even if the church or the leadership has not done with it what ideally they should have been doing.
Also, I think there's a difference between a leadership managing money poorly because they don't know better.
Yeah.
And people managing
Deliberately
money
mismanaging.
Deliberately mismanaging.
Yeah.
I think that is also part of the should also be considered as well with anyone who's kind of in that position. Well, look at the leadership. Is that malice or is that just ignorance?
Yeah, hugely. Going back to the issues of the heart, that's a heart issue for the leadership that they have to reconcile. But then from the heart to the head, are we hiding behind that as an excuse? Well, I have seen it mismanaged elsewhere, or I have experienced it mismanaged elsewhere, therefore I'm not going to. And I would urge somebody to check their heart and check their head on that. And if they need to have a difficult, honest conversation with their leadership and the elders and the board and the oversight, absolutely, that is a scriptural principle. If you have an issue, before you bring your offering first, lay it down and go and reconcile. And if that reconciliation is a heart and a head issue that you have with your leadership, you've got to look at that carefully, right? Because in the same way, you could quite easily turn around and go, is it bad stewardship on my part to be giving money into a church that I know is mismanaging? So that's a very extreme case.
Yeah.
But assuming that isn't the issue, there is something that people might need to check a little bit about. Am I hiding behind this as an excuse not to do this? Which then, is it just a head issue? It's a heart issue.
Yeah. Because I think a lot, especially if you're corporately minded, I think you can easily fall into the gap of, well, I know about investment. I know about budgeting. I know about finances. Why am I going to do this if this is going to be the result of that? Yeah. And I think you end up into a calculation. You end up being in a calculation rather than in a obedience of the heart.
And what's interesting about that, sorry, just very quickly, that is Christians trying to do God's job rather than submitting.
Very good. Yes.
They go, well, it's my job to police, and if I don't police them, and you go, okay, now we're getting into a whole station of trouble.
Yeah. I was just going to take that then into business tithing. So what? Talk me through sort of your thoughts on businesses tithing.
I think that anybody who is running a business can and should do whatever they wish to do. If you look at the biblical model of tithing, it says you shall tithe on your increase. You tithe on all that you have increased. However, businesses aren't people. Businesses don't have a relationship with God. Businesses don't have a relationship with churches. People have a relationship with churches. So if you were to look at it in a very black and white vacuum, you would say the business doesn't tithe. The business pays a salary, income, dividends, whatever, to the individual who owns it or manages it or runs it. That individual tithes. That would be the scripturally, biblically, completely accurate answer. In reality, I know of multiple businesses where people own it and run it, and actually you can't disentangle the two because it's not a limited company. It's, they've called it Mixed Blessings Bakery or something, and they're, it's a family that run it, and there's, right?
Yeah.
And so they are the business, and the business is them. In that instance, they should absolutely tithe, and it may well come out of the business bank account, right? Conversely, if it's a limited company or a limited liability partnership or whatever it is that LLPs don't pay tax on their profits in the same way. But let's talk about a limited company structure in the UK, right? Just for the sake of clarity here. If that business is run by a Christian, is run on Christian principles, then absolutely there should be a generosity and an overflow, that the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. But it wouldn't be tithing in a specific sense. It would be over and above giving and generosity. Would be my view on that. That's cool.
That's interesting.
Okay.
That's good. I like it. Because one of the questions that was on my mind was we have a very multicultural community within the church, and a lot of churches now are increasingly becoming more multicultural,
Which is just awesome.
which we love.
Exactly how it should be.
One thing I've noticed in living in the Philippines and working with Filipinos for a very long time is that they come from the Filipinos that come from this is just them, for example. Filipinos will come from the Philippines to the UK, but their tithes will still go back to their home church.
Yeah.
Now, I can understand the heart behind that.
Yeah.
But what's your thoughts about that?
So again, if we are being entirely scriptural, you tithe where you are fed. You are returning to the storehouse. And so scripturally, biblically, you would tithe to the church that you have submitted yourself under the leadership of. Over and above giving can then go wherever you wish.
This isn't all the Filipinos in our church, by the way. This is just it's an observation on culture rather than it is on.
It's a huge cultural thing that actually is systemic across lots of cultures that travel.
Yeah.
So there are a number of migratory cultures where, I'm half Polish, and you see an awful lot of Polish and Albanian and Eastern European men coming over, working, they're sending money home.
Yeah.
That, I have some very, very dear Nigerian friends, and it's incredibly cultural that you support the family.
Yeah.
Right? You're working in a Western country. That means there's lots of money. You support the family. And that is hugely important, right? That system of support is very, very good. From a tithing perspective, you would tithe where you're fed. You would, and a large part of that actually is because it builds a root system where your money is, your heart is. And again, this is where we talk about the heart and the head. You've got to try and figure that out. If your heart is not in a church, you've got to question whether or not you should be there. But if you are there, you should be rooted and grounded. That's what the word says. It says rooted and grounded. And so money does that, right? Money will root and ground you somewhere, because where your money is, show me your bank balance, I can show you where your heart has been led by your wallet. So
Tesco's.
Ours was takeaways. So that's a challenge again.
Yeah.
And all of these things, like you said, people, it's very well meaning, it's very well intentioned.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it should be super hard line and God's going, right, well, that's it. I'm not rebuking the devourer because blah, blah, His grace is sufficient. It's always sufficient. But there is a principle of operating in the fullness of the blessing.
Sure.
Right? In the same way that people can be saved, but they're not necessarily living in the fullness of the blessing because of things that they do or think or say or operate in that mean, well, it's open-handed or closed-handed. It's not an issue of salvation. Therefore, it's open-handed. But are they able to operate and live in the fullness of the blessing?
Sure.
Possibly not.
Because then the other question that follows on from the one I just gave was how people are now distinguishing how they're fed.
Interesting.
Because based on social media, based on online church, based on how much resources available to be fed, how would you define then how you're fed and where your tithe goes?
So you will note I had a little get out of jail free clause. I said I did say it's where you're fed scripturally, but I said, but it's the leadership that you have chosen to submit yourself under.
Okay, very good.
So that I think should be, because there's so many biblical examples of the oil on the head and the beard and it drips down.